Today I'm looking at Final Fantasy XIII-2, the second of three parts to the Final Fantasy XIII series, a game that I didn't enjoy really playing all that much. Normally I'd pass on a game that I'm not enjoying, but in this case, I made an exception. The reason is mostly because I'm a huge Final Fantasy fan, and I wanted to play through every game in the series at least once. Also, many people talk about how horrible Final Fantasy XIII Part 1 was, and when I played it several years back, I really enjoyed it and found it to be one of my favorite games in the series due to some unique gameplay, an interesting, engaging plot, as well as an incredibly deep lore. Part 2, on the other hand, was the complete opposite, becoming a chore to play through, especially late in the game. There are some really ambitious things that are being done in this game, and the plot has a very interesting concept, but everything feels poorly executed this time. There are some great things about this title despite that, so don't think that this is just going to be me dumping on this game. So let's get into the good and the bad of Final Fantasy XIII-2. I played this on the PlayStation 3 due to the fact that I played the first one also on the PS3, and your save game from that carries over to the new one. But it's also on Xbox 360, Steam, and is backwards compatible on Xbox One and on Xbox Series X that has 4K upscaling. Like I said earlier, this is the sequel to Part 1 and leads into the final part in a similar way to the original Star Wars trilogy. The story opens up with a scene featuring Lightning, the protagonist of the first game. You play as her fighting a villain named Caius in a place called Valhalla, somewhere outside of time as we know it. This part of the story also acts as the tutorial, teaching you the battle system as well as live events, similar to the QuickTime events you see in games like God of War. Sadly, this is the only part of the game where you can play as Lightning. We then jump to 3 years after the events of the first game. You take on the role of Lightning's sister, Sarah, who you saved in the previous one. Very quickly, you realize that something is seriously wrong. Everyone believes that Lightning is dead, sacrificing herself to save Cocoon, the giant floating city from the first game. Only Sarah seems to remember the events of the previous game where Lightning lived through the events. It turns out something has been altering the timeline, and Sarah somehow has the ability to remember the original, real timeline. Sarah's village is attacked by strange creatures that seem to materialize from nowhere when a time traveler named Noel appears with a message from Lightning that he's to protect Sarah and bring her to Valhalla outside of the confines of time to reunite with Lightning. Unlike the first game, this one is very non-linear from the start, as you're able to unlock and explore many different locations in time in whatever order that you like. Many of them are in the same area, just in different time periods. As you start interacting with different events in history to repair and restore the original timeline, new time periods will open up, and alternate timelines will also form. For instance, in one version of the year 400 AF, an artificial god known as a fal'Cie has subjugated the human race, but as you fight back against it, you'll open up an alternate timeline version of 400 AF, where the artificial god was never created and humans still control their own destiny. The time travel aspect is the most interesting part of the story by far. I love time travel stories, even though they tend to have tons of plot holes and inconsistencies. Unfortunately, a lot of the reasons behind what's going on are only revealed just before the final boss fight, and even some of the explanation is found only in a secret ending, requiring 100% of all the side quests to be completed, and there are 160 of them in total. If you beat the game with any less, you don't ever get to find out the true motivation behind the entire plot of the game. I finished the main story in roughly 37 hours, with about 90 to 100 of the quests completed. Completing the other 70 would be a long 30 to 40 hour endeavor. The nice thing, though, is if you actually do enjoy this game, there is a ton of post-game content as well, so they did give you a lot to work with in this game. While you will encounter several of your companions from the first games, like Snow, Hope, and Saz, you sadly only get to play as two characters. Those are Sarah and Noel. A Moogle by the name of Mog, no relation to Final Fantasy VI, also accompanies you, but he only acts as a way to pull things out of phase in time into the present, and also provides a combat mechanic called the Maga Clock. The last game had 6 main characters. That makes this one seem a little boring, since the game loses much of that interaction between the party that Part 1 contained. Also, neither of the main characters are really that interesting. We don't really learn any more about Sarah that we didn't already know from Part 1, and Noel spends most of the game without his memories prior to his encounter with Lightning in Valhalla at the beginning of the game. I found the supporting characters like Hope and Snow far more interesting. As for the gameplay, it uses the same engine and combat system from Final Fantasy XIII, but a lot of things have been scaled down. You don't gain levels anymore. Instead, you just use experience from fights and from completing quests to activate crystals in the Crystarium. These give you more hit points, magic power, and attack power, and also unlock skills and spells for the jobs you pick for your characters. Unfortunately, the Crystarium is linear now, and you can't choose to take HP over attack power or push towards very specific skills or spells. Also, each job has fewer spells and abilities available than any other game save Final Fantasy XV. Missing are time magics entirely, no haste, slow, stop, or demi. Also missing are curing spells that cure multiple targets, and a full life spell as well. All of the elementals like fire, ice, lightning, arrow are missing their 3rd level of strength spells, and things like holy, comet, flare, meteor, water, and ultima are also missing. There's a special skill called Ultima Arrow, but that's just not the same. Of course, enemies like the final boss can cast all of those spells that you can't learn. Also missing are summons, or as they were referred to in the previous entry, Final Fantasy XIII, Eidolons. All of this makes the combat system seem incomplete and makes battles feel a bit boring and repetitive, kind of like being stuck with early game skills and never being able to really unlock all the fun stuff. Each character can learn jobs which allow you to act a certain way in combat. There are commanders, ravagers, medics, saboteurs, synergists, and sentinels. In combat, a commander can only attack. Ravagers can only cast elemental magic, medics can only cast healing spells, saboteurs can only debuff enemies, synergists can only cast buffs on the party, and sentinels can only guard and absorb damage. The trick to combat is to set up what are called paradigms. Each paradigm assigns a job to each character. You'll have one set up for attacking, healing, guarding against massive damage attacks, and getting status effects set up. You change these on the fly in combat to suit the current situation. In tougher battles, you'll need to be very quick with these changes, quickly switching to a healing paradigm before you're dead if you took massive damage. This is highly customizable, allowing you to build a party with strategies to suit your playstyle. The battle system is still turn-based, and a lot of the problems with Final Fantasy combat has been fixed. Every battle starts your characters with full hit points. Some enemies will wound a character, which lowers their max HP until you can rest or use a specific healing item. Only a small portion of the damage you take will wound, so you're not required to always be carrying 99 high potions, 99 X potions, and so on all the time. You also get infinite magic, but only certain spells can be cast by a particular job role, so you don't have to worry about running out of MP by the 3rd fight of a dungeon, effectively making magic users in previous entries mostly useless except in boss fights. Another really great thing unique to this game is that you can capture monsters and use them as your 3rd character in battle. You'll be able to get a ton of these, and they can also be upgraded in level and skills just like your own characters. I luckily got a rare monster in the form of a giant behemoth mid-game, and it made the second half of the game a lot easier as a result. The graphics are really good for the era, lots of sharp and detailed objects, and some really cool effects with the lighting, and outside of time sequences are really unique and done really well. The voice acting is very professional and sounds real and authentic. The music is another thing though. Some of the songs are good, and some are okay, but there's no consistent style. One moment, you've got a J-pop song playing, next, an orchestral track, then you jump on a red chocobo, and you get a death metal song. Nothing flows together, nothing fits the game itself, and it feels like every song was composed by a different person from an entirely different genre. None of it feels like it fits in this game in the slightest bit. All of these seem just kind of minor in comparison to all the good things I talked about. So what really made me not like this game? Well, about midway into the game, the puzzles started. There are several types, and the ones like matching crystals to complete the constellation were okay, but ones like erasing crystal patterns and the clock puzzles are just complete BS. These are incredibly logic and pattern recognition heavy, and if you don't have the skill sets to recognize how the patterns work, like I do, you'll have a really bad time. On top of that, many of them are random, so you can't even look up a walkthrough online. Some of them are even timed, and once time's up, it's randomized again for you to struggle all over. Most of these are optional. Not trying any of these, though, means you get very little in terms of story and background lore for the game, making you feel like you're just fighting your way through one end of an area to the other. Solving the puzzles gives you fragments, which give you info about the time period and characters, including your own party. Skipping them makes you feel like you've gained nothing from the game's story upon completion. Of course, a few of them are mandatory, and if you can't figure them out, there's no way to progress. You can't skip some, and the game gives you absolutely no hints whatsoever. Mog even tells you, quote, "I'll help you in spirit." What an insult to the player after failing the puzzle 10 times already. These clock puzzles I find impossible, and luckily, someone online has a Final Fantasy XIII-2 clock solver. Just make sure to pause the game and enter up to the 12 positions into the app, because most of the clock puzzles are on a very short timer. Had I known of these puzzles when the game started, I might have just said that this isn't the kind of game I'm looking for and passed on it entirely, but for me, I was between 15 to 20 hours into the game when these puzzles started showing their faces. This is a dramatic shift in the game's structure after playing half to two-thirds of the game already, and there are literally close to 100 of these puzzles that you have to complete if you really want to get the full story and background for all the various characters that you'll encounter. Also, the final area of the game has a giant block maze with rotating Tetris-like blocks. This area took me almost 3 hours to get through, and it's not very large. It's incredibly frustrating. You're going back and forth trying to find combinations to progress, while at the same time, you're getting into fights every few steps with the most difficult enemies in the entire game. At least the game tells you which platform you need to eventually arrive at. Otherwise, you could spend 10 hours aimlessly wandering this area. The nice thing is that you can save anywhere in this game, something Square Enix finally decided to add to a Final Fantasy game after nearly 30 years. It's about time. I won't spoil the ending, but I found it to be very unsatisfying. It does end with a to be continued screen. As I mentioned at the beginning, Final Fantasy XIII series plays out like the Star Wars trilogy format. This entry mimics both the tone and narrative feel of The Empire Strikes Back, all the way down to the style of the ending. Unfortunately, there are two things wrong with this ending. First, unlike Star Wars, I never got attached to the main characters in the game. They're very bland compared to the previous cast, as well as this game's own supporting cast. I was far more interested in the fate of a scientist that died in the real timeline, but was alive in the distorted one. She lived her whole life working to help Sarah fix the timeline, all the while knowing that she would cease to exist when it was fixed. Sarah and Noel were just almost like pieces on a chessboard, with a mission to accomplish and not a lot of personal conflict or self-reflection among them. Second, this game feels like it's just filler between Final Fantasy XIII and Lightning Returns, the final chapter of the series. Just playing the main game without side quests, it feels like it should be a 6 to 8 hour DLC. Not much in terms of story came out of this game. It just feels like a padded out setup for the final installment. Overall, this game felt like a chore to play. It felt stripped down from Final Fantasy XIII in features, story, character customization, and main character development. The last third of the game was logic puzzle heavy, with the same 3 types of puzzles that I don't have a very good mental skill set to complete. These really soured me to the entire experience. I really wanted to like this one, especially with a very interesting sci-fi time travel plot and my affinity for the first game in the series. Sadly, this one had tons of potential, but that was all ruined by poor implementation all around. I hope this was an insightful review. I tried to highlight the things that were interesting and done right, which this game does have several of, just a lot of bad implementation on a lot of other things. I can't really recommend this to most people, but if you're really interested in Final Fantasy, the series, or you really liked Final Fantasy XIII, give it a try and see what you think. Let me know in the comments how you felt about this game, or the direction of the Final Fantasy series in the modern day in general. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Until then.